Some killers hide in the shadows. Some run from the police. Edmund Kemper did neither. He was 6'9", nearly 300 pounds. Soft-spoken, intelligent, polite. A man who drank with cops, joked with cops, listened to their fears about a killer stalking young women in Santa Cruz, all while knowing he was that killer. Long before the murders began, Kemper said he already understood his future. The fantasies were there. The violence was there. And the target was always clear. By the time 8 women were dead, including his own mother, Kemper didn't flee. He didn't destroy evidence. He didn't deny what he'd done. He picked up the phone and called the police. They laughed. They thought it was a prank. Tonight on Unsaid Case Files, we tell the story of a killer who was seen, studied, and released, and the system that let him walk free until it was far too late. This is the case of Edmund Kemper. Edmund Kemper was different from the very beginning. Born in 1948 in Burbank, California, he wasn't just a big baby. He was enormous. By early childhood, he towered over kids his age. By his teens, he was already frightening adults. But inside the giant frame was a quiet, intelligent boy, raised in a home filled with cruelty. Edmund's parents divorced when he was young, and custody fell to his mother, Clarnell. She mocked him relentlessly, his size, his appearance, his awkwardness. She told him no woman would ever love him, that he was strange, that he was wrong. At night, she locked him in the basement, claiming she feared he might hurt his sisters. Down there, alone in the dark, Edmund learned isolation before he learned empathy. The boy didn't fight back. He didn't scream. He absorbed it. By elementary school, Edmund was already living in 2 worlds: the quiet, polite child everyone saw, and the violent thoughts no one could. When his sister once teased him about liking a teacher and asked why he didn't kiss her, Edmund answered calmly, "If I kissed her, I'd have to kill her first." It wasn't a joke. It was a glimpse. By the time other children were learning right from wrong, Edmund Kemper was learning something far darker: that love and violence could exist in the same thought. And that lesson would shape everything that came next. For most children, games are how they learn boundaries. For Edmund Kemper, games were how he rehearsed violence. By the time Edmund was a young boy, his imagination had turned dark and detailed. He didn't just play with his sister's dolls. He dismantled them. He pulled their heads from their bodies, removed their hands, lined the pieces up with ritual-like care. To Edmund, the dolls weren't toys. They were stand-ins. One of his favorite games wasn't cops and robbers or hide and seek. It was execution. He called it gas chamber, sometimes electric chair. He would ask his sister to tie him up, pretend to flip a switch, and watch as Edmund collapsed to the floor, writhing, choking, dying, all by design. This wasn't curiosity. It was fixation. Around this same time, Edmund began stalking from a distance. He admitted later that he would sneak out of his house at night, armed with a bayonet, and watch his second-grade teacher through her windows. Not to speak to her, not to touch her, just to imagine. When his sister once mocked him for liking the teacher and asked why he didn't try to kiss her, Edmund answered without hesitation, "If I kiss her, I'd have to kill her first." No fear, no laughter, just certainty. These weren't passing thoughts. They were fantasies growing more structured, more violent, and more personal. By this point, Edmund Kemper wasn't pretending to die anymore. He was practicing. The violence needed an outlet. At just 10 years old, Edmund killed the family cat and buried it. Later, he dug the body back up and removed its head, displaying it as a kind of trophy. He didn't panic. He didn't confess. What stayed with him wasn't fear. It was a sense of control and the satisfaction of deceiving the people around him. When another cat replaced it, Edmund killed again. This time the act was more deliberate, more focused, less impulsive. Years later, experts would describe cruelty to animals as an early warning sign. But in cases like this, it isn't curiosity. It's preparation. Edmund wasn't testing limits. He was conditioning himself. As he entered puberty, his thoughts grew darker and more intrusive. The fantasies expanded beyond animals and into large-scale violence. Thoughts he didn't fully understand, but couldn't escape. They were constant, unwanted, and increasingly intense. His mother noticed the change. She began isolating him at night, locking him in the basement out of fear for the safety of others in the home. The isolation deepened. So did the anger. By the time Edmund Kemper reached his early teens, the boundary between thought and action had already begun to erode. The only thing missing was a human victim. By his early teens, Edmund Kemper was no longer welcome at home. The arguments with his mother were constant, violent, at least verbally. She called him a weirdo, she feared him, and she made sure he knew it. At 14, Edmund ran away, hoping to find refuge with his father in Southern California. But the reunion he imagined never came. His father had a new family, a new life, and no place for his son. Rejected once again, Edmund was sent north to live with his paternal grandparents on a remote ranch near North Fork, California, tucked into the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. It was supposed to be a fresh start. Instead, it became another prison. Edmund's grandmother was domineering and humiliating, much like his mother. She belittled him, corrected him constantly, stripped away what little sense of control he had left. The isolation was complete. Miles from town, miles from friends, surrounded by silence and resentment. For Edmund, the rage had nowhere to go, no outlet, no escape. The fantasies returned, sharper and more focused than ever. This time they weren't about strangers. They were about the people closest to him. And on that quiet ranch in the summer of 1964, Edmund Kemper made a decision that would change everything. In the summer of 1964, the pressure finally broke. Edmund Kemper was 15 years old, living on his grandparents' isolated ranch near North Fork, California. There were no witnesses, no neighbors close enough to hear anything. Just Edmund and the people he blamed for his misery. One afternoon, after yet another argument, Edmund picked up a rifle. He later said there was no sudden rage, no blackout, just curiosity. He shot his grandmother in the head. When she fell, he didn't stop. He stabbed her repeatedly afterward, not out of fear, but compulsion. Later, he would explain it chillingly simply. I just wanted to see what it felt like to kill Grandma. When his grandfather returned home and pulled into the driveway, Edmund met him there. He raised the rifle again and fired. Kemper would later claim he killed his grandfather out of mercy, so the man wouldn't have to discover what Edmund had done to his wife. Afterward, Edmund didn't run. He didn't hide the bodies. He didn't destroy evidence. He called his mother. Then he called the police. And he waited. When officers arrived, they found something they didn't expect. A massive teenage boy, calm, cooperative, and disturbingly articulate. There were no tears, no panic, no visible remorse. Psychiatrists quickly declared the crime incomprehensible for someone so young. Edmund was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and sent to Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security facility for the criminally insane. It should have been the end of the story. Instead, it was only the beginning. Because inside Atascadero, Edmund Kemper wasn't being cured. He was being educated. At 15 years old, Edmund Kemper was locked inside Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security facility for the criminally insane. To the outside world, it looked like justice. A dangerous boy removed from society. A monster contained. But inside those walls, something very different was happening. Doctors diagnosed Edmund as a paranoid schizophrenic. They believed his crimes were the result of mental illness, something that could be treated, managed, even cured. They were wrong. Edmund was quiet, polite, attentive. He followed rules, completed assignments, spoke intelligently during evaluations. Psychological testing revealed something that surprised everyone. His IQ was extraordinarily high, bordering on genius. And Edmund understood something the doctors didn't. This place wasn't punishment. It was a classroom. At Atascadero, Edmund was surrounded by rapists, murderers, and violent offenders. Instead of fearing them, he listened. He learned how they thought, how they described their crimes, how they justified what they'd done. Even more importantly, Edmund learned how psychiatrists thought. He was trained to administer psychological tests to other inmates, including the very tools used to decide who was safe and who wasn't. He learned how questions were scored, how answers were interpreted, how to appear reformed. Later, Kemper would admit that he studied the system carefully and learned exactly how to beat it. 5 years passed. Doctors saw a model patient, A success story. Someone rehabilitated. Against warnings, and even against Edmund's own statements that he still had violent fantasies, the state made a decision that would echo for decades. They let him go. And they sent him back to the one place that had created the monster in the first place. Home. On his 21st birthday, Edmund Kemper walked out of Atascadero State Hospital. 5 years earlier, he had murdered his grandparents. Now doctors called him rehabilitated. Despite multiple warnings from psychiatrists, and despite Edmund admitting he still had violent fantasies, the state made a critical choice. They erased his juvenile record, and they released him back into his mother's care. By now, Edmund was 6'9" and nearly 300 pounds. Impossible to miss, yet somehow overlooked. He tried to become a police officer, drawn to authority and control. But he was rejected, too tall to wear the uniform. The rejection only sharpened the resentment. Inside, nothing had changed. The fantasies were still there. The urges were still there. Only now, Edmund Kemper wasn't a locked-away patient. He was free. Freedom didn't bring peace. For Edmund Kemper, freedom meant going back to war with his mother. They lived together in Aptos, California, just outside Santa Cruz. The arguments were constant, explosive. Neighbors could hear them through the walls. His mother belittled him the same way she always had, mocking his size, his failures, his inability to connect with women. She reminded him daily that he was unwanted, and Edmund absorbed every word. During the day, he tried to build a life. He worked odd jobs, attended community college, and obsessed over law enforcement. He wanted to be a cop, not to protect people, but to belong. When the police department rejected him for being too tall, Edmund found another way inside. He started frequenting a local bar called the Jury Room, a hangout for Santa Cruz police officers. They liked him. He was friendly, helpful, harmless. They called him Big Ed. He listened as officers talked openly about crime in the area, about missing women, about a killer they hadn't caught yet. All the while, Edmund was taking mental notes. Inside his mind, the fantasies were growing stronger, more urgent. And after years of practice, in thought, in animals, in blood, Edmund Kemper was ready to begin again. In May of 1972, Edmund Kemper stopped pretending. After years of fantasies, practice, and restraint, he chose his first victims. 2 young women hitchhiking near Berkeley. Marianne Pesci and Anita Lucchesa were college students. They were trusting. They needed a ride. Edmund pulled over in his Ford Galaxy and offered help. He was calm, polite, non-threatening. They got in. Instead of driving them where they asked, Edmund turned onto a secluded road. There, he handcuffed one woman and locked the other in the trunk. Both were stabbed and strangled. Afterward, he placed their bodies in the trunk and drove home. On the way, a police officer pulled him over for a broken taillight. The officer spoke to Edmund. never checked the trunk, and let him go. 2 bodies were inches away from being discovered. Back at his apartment, Edmund photographed the corpses, violated them, and dismembered their bodies. He bagged the remains and scattered them across remote areas near Loma Prieta Mountain. Their severed heads were thrown into a ravine. For Edmund Kemper, this wasn't chaos. It was confirmation. He had done it and gotten away with it. The system hadn't stopped him. The police hadn't suspected him. And now, he knew something terrifying for certain. He could keep going. After the first murders, Edmund Kemper didn't spiral into panic. He grew methodical. He began cruising familiar routes around Santa Cruz, watching for young women who needed a ride. Hitchhikers, students, girls who trusted the wrong stranger. His car became a controlled space, quiet, predictable, lethal. On a September evening in 1972, 15-year-old Aiko Ku missed her bus and chose to hitchhike. Edmund picked her up and drove to a remote area. When he pulled a gun, he briefly locked himself out of his own car. Aiko, still trusting, let him back in. He killed her anyway. Afterward, Edmund didn't rush home. He stopped at a bar, had a few drinks, then returned to his apartment. He later said he opened the trunk like a fisherman admiring a catch. The violence no longer felt urgent. It felt routine. Months later, in January of 1973, he picked up 18-year-old Cindy Shaw near Cabrillo College. He shot her and took her body back to his mother's house. He hid it overnight in his room. When his mother left for work the next morning, Edmund continued, removing evidence, dismembering the body, keeping parts as trophies. He buried Cindy's severed head in his mother's garden, positioned so it faced her bedroom window. It wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. By now, Edmund had a process. Pick up a hitchhiker. Kill quickly. Take the body home. Control the aftermath. Each murder sharpened his confidence. Each success convinced him he was invisible. But the truth was darker. These women weren't the end goal. They were practice. By early 1973, fear was spreading across Santa Cruz. Young women were disappearing. Police suspected a serial killer, and students were warned to be careful, to only accept rides from people they trusted. Edmund Kemper adapted. Because his mother worked at the University of California, Santa Cruz, Edmund had access to something that made him seem safe: a university parking sticker. It was the perfect disguise. On February 5th, 1973, after a violent argument with his mother, Edmund left the house already hunting. On campus, he picked up 2 students separately, Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu. They believed he was one of them. As he drove away from the university, Edmund slowed the car. He shot Rosalind in the head without warning, then turned toward Alice in the back seat. The first shots missed. The third didn't. Once again, Edmund brought the bodies back to his mother's home. This time he didn't even bother hiding them carefully. He had perfected the ritual. Decapitation, violation, dismemberment, disposal. For Edmund Kemper, this was no longer about risk. It was about control. But something had changed. With every murder, the satisfaction faded faster. The fantasies demanded more. And the person at the center of those fantasies was still alive. By the spring of 1973, Edmund Kemper understood something he could no longer ignore. The murders weren't enough. Each victim brought temporary relief, minutes, hours at most, before the rage returned. The fantasies didn't stop. They sharpened. Psychologists would later agree on one truth. The young women were substitutes, stand-ins for the person Edmund couldn't escape, his mother. Every argument at home fed the cycle. Every insult, every reminder of failure, every mocking comment about women and worth pushed him closer to the edge. She controlled him emotionally, belittled him publicly, humiliated him privately. And yet, she relied on him. To neighbors and coworkers, she painted Edmund as a burden, a strange, oversized son who would never leave. To Edmund, it felt like a life sentence. By now, he had proven he could kill without being caught. He had outsmarted police, manipulated systems, walked freely among officers who trusted him. The fantasy he had rehearsed for years no longer involved strangers on the roadside. It ended at home, in a familiar bedroom, with a woman who had shaped his hatred from childhood. Edmund later admitted the truth plainly. The murders of the co-eds were preparation, and the final act was coming. On the night of April 20th, 1973, the war finally ended. Edmund Kemper waited until his mother came home from a party. She went to her bedroom, climbed into bed, and began reading. When Edmund entered the room, she looked at him and said, "I suppose you're going to want to sit up all night and talk now." Edmund replied quietly, "No. Good night." He waited. When she fell asleep, he returned, armed with a hammer and a knife. He struck her in the head, then slit her throat. Afterward, Edmund did not flee. He stayed. He decapitated her body and spent hours acting out the rage he had carried since childhood. He screamed at her severed head, threw darts at it, smashed her face in. In one final symbolic act, he removed her larynx and forced it into the garbage disposal. The machine jammed and spat it back out. Edmund later said, "That seemed appropriate, considering how much she'd bitched and screamed at me all those years." But even then, it wasn't over. Edmund cleaned the house. He hid his mother's body in a closet. Then he went out drinking. Later that night, he invited her best friend, 59-year-old Sally Hallett, over for dinner. When she arrived, Edmund strangled her. Another body, another closet. The next morning, Edmund left a note for police. Mocking, controlled, final. With his mother dead, the purpose was gone. There was nothing left to rehearse. Nothing left to prove. So Edmund Kemper did something no one expected. He got in his car and drove away. Edmund Kemper didn't run because he was afraid. He ran because the story was over. After killing his mother and her best friend, Edmund Kemper got into his car and drove, non-stop, more than 1,000 miles to Pueblo, Colorado. He swallowed caffeine pills to stay awake, convinced police were already hunting him. They weren't. There were no alerts on the radio, no breaking news, no manhunt. When Edmund arrived in Colorado, he stopped at a phone booth and called the Santa Cruz Police Department. He confessed. The officer on the other end laughed. They thought it was a joke. A prank by Big Ed, the friendly guy who drank with cops and listened to their stories. Edmund hung up. He called again. Still disbelief. It took several phone calls before an officer finally listened long enough to hear the details. Details only the killer could know. Locations. Methods. Evidence that hadn't been made public. Only then did the tone change. Police drove out to arrest him. Edmund waited calmly. When taken into custody, he confessed to everything: the hitchhikers, the students, the mutilations, the murders of his mother and Sally Hallett. Later, Edmund explained why he turned himself in. The urge was gone. He said the killing no longer served a purpose, emotionally, physically, or psychologically. The fantasy had ended with his mother's death. Without her, there was nothing left to fuel it. For the police, the realization was devastating. The killer they had been searching for, the one they had spoken to, joked with, trusted, had been sitting right beside them all along. When Edmund Kemper stood trial in 1973, there was never any real doubt about his guilt. He had confessed in detail. He corrected investigators when they got facts wrong. He explained his crimes calmly, sometimes clinically. His defense pleaded insanity, but 3 court-appointed psychiatrists disagreed. They said Edmund Kemper knew exactly what he was doing, and that he knew it was wrong. When asked what punishment he believed he deserved, Kemper didn't hesitate. Death by torture. California's death penalty was suspended at the time, so instead he was sentenced to life in prison, 8 concurrent terms, and sent to the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. There, Edmund Kemper became something else entirely: a model inmate, a counselor to other prisoners, an articulate interview subject for FBI profilers studying serial killers. His conversations helped shape modern criminal profiling. His case became a blueprint, not just for understanding violent offenders, but for recognizing catastrophic failure. Because Edmund Kemper was not invisible. He was evaluated. He was diagnosed. He was released. And 10 people paid the price. Today, Kemper remains incarcerated, repeatedly denied parole, widely regarded as too dangerous to ever be free. His story isn't just about evil. It's about what happens when warning signs are documented and ignored. Some cases ask who committed the crime. This one asks why no one stopped it. If you want more stories like this, told with respect for the victims and clarity about the failures, Follow Unsaid Case Files, subscribe, and share this episode. Because some crimes are loud, and others were never supposed to happen at all.